The law of demand is all about the inverse relationship between price and quantity. So as P increases, Q decreases, right? When the price of something goes up, we buy less of it. It can also be said as demand slopes down. We have a graph, price on the y-axis, Q on the x-axis, demand slopes down, which means that, start here, if price goes up, quantity is going to go down. So as price increases, quantity demanded will decrease. Number 2, so a normal good, that's a good where when your income increases, your demand increases. So if his income goes down, that means his demand decreases. So it's going to look like this. So it means it shifts left. So for a given price, price is here. So price doesn't change. But if he was producing this quantity, then he consuming that quantity, and now his consumption decreases. So what's going on? Well, he likes to go to restaurants, and so he was consuming this many restaurant meals. Then he loses his job, his income goes down, so we expect him to buy fewer restaurant meals. Next, we're going to continue to talk about a normal good. Now we're thinking about what happens when the price of beer increases. So one of the things to remember when we're talking about a normal or an inferior good, normal and inferior goods, those relate to changes in income. What we're thinking about here is that the price of beer increases. And so if you remember, when we change price, that is not a shift of the curve, that's movement along a curve. So we'll start off with Eric's demand for beer. Notice we have a downward sloping demand. And the price of beer increases. That means, for example, price was here, it increases up to here. So when price increases, quantity demanded decreases. So we're not shifting, we have a decrease in quantity demanded, so movement left along the demand curve because beer got more expensive, so he's buying less of it. 4. Initially, the market for salmon is in equilibrium with a price of 10, quantity of 5,000. Scientific study finds that people who eat salmon tend to live longer. What happens to price and quantity? Okay. With a graph of price and quantity, we'll start off in equilibrium looking like this. We have upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, and people who eat salmon live longer. People are going to like salmon more. We will increase demand for salmon. That's a shift to the right. And what happens? We go from here to here. So price increases and quantity increases. Price will increase and quantity will increase. Peanut butter and jelly are complements. Let's think about what this means. So complements are two goods we tend to consume together. So let's think about what happens. When the price of jelly increases, the law of demand says the quantity of jelly will decrease. And this has nothing to do with substitutes or complements. This is just when the price of a good goes up, people consume less of it. Well, complements means that these are goods we like to consume together, which means that if quantity of jelly is going to go down, that means quantity of peanut butter is also going to go down. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches got more expensive, so I'm eating fewer peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which means that I am eating less peanut butter. The answer here is A, quantity of peanut butter decreases. We don't know anything about price. Nothing says anything about price here. Number 6, check is deciding how many tacos to eat. Tacos cost $2 each. So what you want to think about here is, and this is something that we have seen a lot. So you think about if we made a table, for example, marginal benefit and marginal cost. And so we know that his marginal cost is always $2 per taco. Well, what's his marginal benefit? We'll just sort of think about making up some numbers. We have first 5, 4, then he gets 2, then he gets 1, then he gets 0. So the first taco gives him 5 units of $5 in marginal benefit. Second was 4, and so on. Well, when's he going to eat? Well, he's going to consider each taco. So that's thinking on the margin. So do I want one more taco? So he starts off. Do I want to have this first taco? Yes. Benefit of 5 is greater than a cost of 2. Now let's look at the next taco. Benefit of 4 is better than a cost of 2. I'll do that. Last one, benefit of 2, cost of 2. I'm indifferent between that one. It'll cost me $2, but it'll benefit $2. That'll be the last one I consume, right? Because beyond that, if I consume any more, I'll get a marginal benefit of only 1, and it will have cost me 2, so I'm not going to want to do that. So what did Jake just do when he was making that decision? He continued to eat tacos until the marginal benefit of the last taco eaten was $2. So a couple of things to note about the incorrect answers. So for B, he does not eat the number that maximizes marginal benefit because the one that maximizes marginal benefit is the first answer. Is the first unit. So the very first taco he has is the one that gives him the most benefit. So the answer is not B. He's going to keep eating the second and third taco because they still give him some benefit, just not as much as the first taco. Okay. So for 7, if we're looking for a point that is attainable and not efficient, attainable means it's something you can produce. Efficient means you're not using all of your resources. So this example, we're not consuming or making as many baked goods as we possibly could. So that would be D. D is attainable, so it's within this blue line. It's not efficient because it's not on the blue line, right? So because if we're producing at D, it would actually be possible for us to move over to here. Think about this point, it's going to produce more cakes and more pies. So we're not using all of our resources when we're at D. We could have made more of both goods. Number 8, the below table gives the total benefit in dollars that Ron gets from making tables. What is the marginal benefit he gets from the third table he makes? So marginal benefit is thinking about when we have one more table, what is our benefit? So when he goes, I guess I should say tables. When he goes from making 2 tables to 3, right? That's the marginal tables when he goes from 2 to 3. That means benefit goes from 13 to 15. So it increases by 2. His total benefit increases by 2. So his marginal benefit is 2. Number 9, Andrea can produce 10 milkshakes or 2 hamburgers. Brian can produce 3 or 1. Which of the following statements is true? So let's look at this. Andrea, milkshake, hamburger. Brian, milkshake, hamburger. So one option for Andrea, she can make 10 and 0, or she can make 0 milkshakes, 20 hamburgers. Brian could make 3 no hamburgers, or no milkshakes and 1 hamburger. So anytime we're thinking about comparative advantage, what we need to do is calculate opportunity cost. And so Andrea would have to, if Andrea wants to get 10 more milkshakes, she has to give up 20 hamburgers. So give up 20 hamburgers, get 10 milkshakes. Same as saying give up 2 hamburgers, get 1 milkshake, which means that the opportunity cost of a milkshake is 2 hamburgers for her. Okay. Now let's look at Brian. Brian can, if he wants to go from the bottom to the top, if he will give up 1 hamburger to get 3 milkshakes. So he'll go from 1 hamburger to 0. If he does, he's going to gain 3 milkshakes. Same as saying if he gives up 1/3 of a hamburger, he'll get 1 milkshake. So for him, the opportunity cost of a milkshake is 1/3 hamburger. So how do we get these opportunity costs? Well, one thing to remember is that the opportunity cost of something is what you have to give up to get it. So for Andrea, she has to give up 2 hamburgers to get a milkshake. So her opportunity cost of milkshake is 2 hamburgers. Brian, he has to give up 1/3 of a hamburger to get a milkshake. So for him, the opportunity cost of a milkshake is 1/3 of a hamburger. So now what that means is that, remember, opportunity cost relates to who has, comparative advantage relates to who has the lower opportunity cost. So who has the lower opportunity cost of making a milkshake? Well, it costs Andrea 2 hamburgers. It only costs Brian 1. So Brian has comparative advantage at milkshakes, which means everybody always has comparative advantage at one good. Andrea has comparative advantage at hamburgers. So the correct answer here is going to be B. Brian has a comparative advantage at making milkshakes. Let's go on to number 10. So notice in Spartania, as an autarky, the price of corn is $3. Equilibrium world price is $5. So start off with supply and demand in Spartania, which means that here the price is $3. Notice that the equilibrium world price is $5, so it's above. So the world price is up here. So if we allow imports and exports, what that's going to mean is we will have this many units produced. So that'll be, we'll have this many units demanded, this many units supplied, because notice that's where this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve, so this will be QS. This number right here, those are going to be goods that are exported. So we think about what just happened. By allowing world trade, that made the price go up. So we're going to have fewer units purchased, right? So we're corn. So now the consumers are no longer going to get to enjoy $3 corn. They're going to have to pay $5 for their corn. So they're going to be buying less corn. So we have quantity demanded decreases, quantity supplied increases. So the suppliers are going to be producing more corn, and they're going to be able to sell it at a higher price. So when this happens, producers are better off and consumers are worse off. Again, producers are making more and selling it at a higher price. Demanders, consumers, are consuming less and having to pay more to do it. So producers will be worse off. That is not true. Quantity of corn demanded will exceed quantity of corn supplied. No, it's the opposite. Quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. Spartania will export corn. That is correct. Remember, we're producing QS, only consuming QD. So this right here is that these units are exported. That's the correct answer. Total welfare does not decrease. As we've learned, whenever we allow international trade, total welfare increases. The answer is C. So the slope of a supply curve, straightforward, supply slopes up. Why is that? Because when the price increases, quantity increases. So when price goes up, producers will produce and sell more. A federal subsidy on milk. Subsidies are an example we had of a supply shifter. So what a subsidy for milk will do is that will get companies to produce milk. That encourages milk production. So that shifts supply out or to the right. It's going to look like supply was here, so which meant that if the price was P, I would produce, call this Q1. If price is P2, quantity is going to be Q2 sloping up. Now let's suppose that we have a subsidy, and a subsidy again is going to shift supply to the right. So what's going on here is if I produce the good, I'm going to get paid by the government some amount of money. Well, that's going to encourage me to produce more. Supply shifts to the right. So an outward or rightward shift of the supply curve. Okay, part of US GDP. Let me go through these. If I hire a private chef to cook dinner for my family, that is me purchasing a good or service. It's a final good. I'm not reselling the dinner after I eat it, after I've purchased it. So A is going to be the answer. Let's look at the rest of them. B is not correct because when a pizza restaurant buys tomato sauce, that is not a final good. The pizza sauce is going to be baked into a pizza. Once the pizza is sold, the pizza will count towards GDP, but the tomato sauce is an intermediate good. Restore restaurant was a used pizza oven that was made in Michigan. If it is used, it is not counted towards GDP. We count the goods produced that year, goods that are being sold as a final good for the first time. I'm hired to teach an economic class in London because I do the work in London. I'm being paid in London. That counts towards England's GDP, the United States. Following is not including the expenditures approach of calculating GDP. Expenditures approach, Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumption is C. Net exports is NX. Government spending is G. Taxes is the answer. Taxes are not part of GDP. Government, when the government spends money, they used with the taxes they collected, the government spending counts as GDP, but the taxes collected do not. It's not a component of gross investment. So gross investment is going to include things like what we called inventory investment. So that would be B, refrigerators that are produced but not sold during a time period. So the business's inventory grew because it added some refrigerators to its inventory. It hasn't sold them yet, so that counts as investment. So we're looking for things that are not a component. That's not correct. Constructions of apartment buildings, we've talked about that as residential investment. That's a component of gross investment. General Motors builds a car factory. Gross investment, they said that those are goods produced but not consumed or sold by a business during a time period. So a car factory is a component of gross investment. So the answer here is A. The potatoes that McDonald's buys, that's an intermediate good. So It's not going to count as investment. Once the fries are sold, those French fries are going to count towards GDP as part of consumption. Okay, so in 2016, nominal GDP was 100. In 2017, it went down to 90. So from 2016, 2017, nominal GDP went from 100 to 90, so it decreased 10%. Prices of all goods increased by 10%. So that would be saying that there was 10% inflation. The price of the CPI went from 100 to 110. So increased 10%. So first thing we're going to look at is to see nominal GDP went from 100 to 90. So our nominal GDP went down. So if you actually calculate the amount all of our stuff sold for, that went from 100 down to 90. The other thing that happened is the price level went from 100 to 110, which means we had 10% inflation. So if nothing had changed in terms of how much we were producing, and the only thing that changed was prices, nominal GDP then would have gone from 100 to 110, right? Because we're producing the same amount of stuff, but everything sells for more. Well, not only did we not have our nominal GDP go from 100 to 110, so not only did we not keep up with inflation, we actually lost money on nominal GDP. And so what we want to think about here is we are definitely producing less, right? If we produced the same amount as before, our nominal GDP would have gone from 100 to 110. Well, the fact that it, instead of doing that, went from 100 down to 90 means that real GDP went down. Just to hold real GDP constant with our 10% inflation, nominal would have needed to go from 100 to 110. We did not do that. We went from 100 down to 90. So real GDP decreased. So productivity is a measure of output per hour worked. So if we're going to improve productivity, what we want to think about is we're not just increasing the number of people working or the number of hours they're working. Productivity means given somebody working for an hour, they're able to produce more. So a cash transfer is not going to affect productivity. An increase in hours worked, again, like we said, that is not what productivity is about. Productivity is about producing more per hour. Okay. Similarly, individuals working more years of their life and retiring later. Nope, that's not improving what you produce per hour. That's meaning you work more hours and more years. Whereas if someone invents a new way of generating wind power, we talked about productivity improvements being things like new inventions. So the answer here is 17. That is going to allow people to produce more. 18, what is cyclical employment? So cyclical employment relates to the business cycle. So the business cycle, and specifically if you find yourself cyclically unemployed, that means you're at a down part of the business cycle, which means you're in a recession. So the answer here is C. Mike loses his job when his employer has a reduction in demand during a recession. So let's go through the rest of them. So A, when Jerome chooses to stay home, he is no longer in the labor force. He is not unemployed at all. He's a person who's not in the labor force. He's left to stay at home with his children. Taylor cannot get any job interviews and eventually quits trying to find a job. We called those discouraged workers. Remember, you only count as unemployed if you're looking for work. Taylor gave up looking for work, so he is out of the labor force as a discouraged worker. And for D, because Annie doesn't have computer skills, that means she does not have the necessary skills for the job market. So that is what we call structural unemployment. Her skills and abilities do not match what the market is looking for. So she counts as unemployed, but she is structurally unemployed, not cyclically unemployed. So in order to calculate CPI, what we need to do is find the way that the price of a basket of goods changes for 2 different years. We generally will have our base year have a CPI of 100. So let's look at the price of a basket in 2015. In 2015, we would consume 5 gallons of milk at a price of $5 and 25 gallons of gasoline at a price of $1. So what does that mean? So 5 times 5 is 25, 25 times 1 is 25, so we're spending $25 on milk and $25 on gasoline. So we're spending a total of $50. That's the cost of a market basket in 2015. How about in 2016? 2016, notice the contents of the basket were the same both years. So we're still consuming the same stuff, we just had the price of the goods change. So what that means is in 2016, now we're still buying 5 gallons of milk, but now we have to pay $6. 5 gallons of milk times $6 per gallon. And we are still buying 25 gallons of gasoline, and the price is still $1 per gallon. So that means now the cost of our basket is $30 plus $25, so $55. The CPI was 100 in 2015. So this is price. This is CPI. Yeah, it was 100. And so what this means is, remember, if we normalize price of 50, meaning that it's a CPI of 100, what we think about here is, all right, what percent did price go up? Price went up 10%, right? 55 minus 50 divided by 50 is equal to 5 divided by 50, which is 1/10. So 10%. So what that means is if price went up 10%, CPI is also going to go up 10%. 100 plus 10% is 110. The other way to do this is if you see CPI is 100, price is 50, you can say, oh, well, price times 2 is equal to CPI, and 55 times 2 is equal to 110. So that's 110. Contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary is what we do when we're trying to contract the economy. So if it's growing too fast, usually we're seeing high inflation. So what would we do if we wanted to sort of slow down economic growth? Well, if you remember, monetary policy is what the Fed does, where they adjust the money supply. Fiscal policy is what Congress does. So that's done through government spending and taxing. So if we wanted to contract the economy using fiscal policy, there's 2 options. We can increase taxes, or we can decrease government spending. So the answer here, B, an increase in taxes. (21). So you can look at the formulas for G and T. The other thing we can think about is that the difference between them is that, so if we want to compare, if we're trying to have a bigger multiplier, do we want to use government spending or use taxes? Well, one of the things to remember is if the government spends $1,000, that's $1,000 that go right into the economy, and somebody is going to collect $1,000, whoever is paid by the government, they're going to have $1,000. They're going to save some of it and spend some of it. So the government spending starts off with spending $1,000. With the tax multiplier, if we were to give somebody a tax cut, we're going to give them $1,000. However, we know that marginal propensity to consume is generally less than 1. So what we're going to do is they're going to take the $1,000, save some of it, and spend the rest. So if we think about it as tax cut of 1,000, and we're going to say marginal propensity to consume equals 0.9. So that means, so what is our total spending? Well, we're going to start off, if I get a $1,000 tax cut, I'm going to save 10% of it and spend 90% of it. That's what MPC says. So I'm going to spend 900. Next person's going to get 900. They're going to spend 90% of that. So 90 times 0.9 is 810 plus 0.9 times 810, and so on. Now let's compare government spending increase by $1,000. Let's look at the spending. So right off the bat, we have $1,000 spent by the government. Then wherever the government spends that money, that person's going to spend 90% of it plus 900. And after that, it'll proceed like the tax cut. So plus 810 plus 0.9 times 810 and so on. So what we see is that government spending has a larger multiplier because our initial spend, the first thing that is spent is $1,000 instead of having the tax cut of $1,000 where the first thing that happens is 10% of it is saved. So if an increase in government spending of $1,000 leads to a total boost in spending larger than the tax cut of $1,000, that means government spending must have a larger multiplier. So that would be B. So you receive a $500 bonus, you spend $100 of it. So marginal propensity to consume is when you get some more income, what is your propensity? What is your tendency to consume it? How much of that do you consume? Well, here MPC equals change in consumption divided by change in income, which here is 100 over 500, which is 0.2. Notice, however, that in the problem we're being asked about our marginal propensity to save. We know that marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to save equals 1. Why is that? Because all money, 100% of your money is either spent or saved of your disposable income. So that means, so if marginal propensity to consume is 0.2, marginal propensity to save must be 0.8 or 80%. So to determine the total increase in expenditures based on use getting a raise, we need to think about the expenditures multiplier. So in order to do the expenditures multiplier, what we need to know is marginal propensity to consume, because expenditures multiplier, so M sub E is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. So here, our marginal propensity to consume, we are consuming half of our income. We get 100. If I get an extra 100, I'll spend half of it. So that is 1 over 1 minus 0.5, which is equal to 1 over 1/2, which is equal to 2. So now our multiplier is 2. And so what that means is we can take an initial increase in spending of 50. So total increase equals the initial spending of 50 times our marginal propensity, or our multiplier, which is 2. 50 times 2 is 100, so our answer is B. 24, what we're thinking about here is the shape of aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand, we think about that as the demand for GDP in an economy. And as we learned, aggregate demand slopes down just like product demand slopes down. So we know that aggregate demand slopes down. And why is that? Well, let's look at B and C. So C says, as prices increases, the buying power of cash decreases. And so that's going to be the correct answer. So what's going on here is, remember, this is the price level. And this x-axis is demand for all goods, so it's demand for GDP. And when the prices increase, the money in your wallet now is worth less. And so because the x-axis represents real GDP, so the actual amount of stuff, well, if you're carrying around $100 in your pocket, there's some inflation occurs, all of a sudden your $100 can buy less. You can purchase less real GDP. So that's why the answer is C. If you look at B, the suggestion there for why it slopes down is that as prices increase, buyers substitute to other goods. Well, as we talked about, that is not something that can happen with aggregate demand, because aggregate demand is the demand for all goods. So we can't substitute from a car to a boat, because both cars and boats are included in aggregate demand. The answer is C. So this one is going to look at the relationship between interest rates and investment. So this is the one where we talked about how if you're going to buy some forklifts, that the cost of a forklift is determined by the interest rate. And as the interest rate goes up, your cost of getting a forklift goes up because you have to pay higher interest rate if you're borrowing. It means that our investment demand curve looks like this. This is going to be the interest rate, call that R. This is going to be investment. And it slopes down because as the price of borrowing goes down, number of forklifts we purchase goes up. So what that means is if the real interest rate decreases, that's going to be movement along the curve. That'd be, for example, us moving from here to here. It goes down. So first thing we see is quantity of investment goes up. Remember, aggregate demand is demand for GDP, and investment is one component of that. So aggregate demand increases when investment increases. So aggregate demand increasing, that means it's shifting to the right. So the answer here is C. Investment will increase, aggregate demand will shift to the right. So in 26, what happened was aggregate demand shifted left from 81 to 82, which means equilibrium moved from here to here. Notice what happened then. Price level went from 100 down to 110, or 110 down to 100. GDP went from 15 down to 10. The government is considering increasing government spending to boost aggregate demand, and we want to know how much government spending needs to increase by. And so what we can think about is that we shifted from 81 to 82. We need to get from 82 back to 81. In order to do that, we essentially need to shift from the dark blue back to the light blue. And so how much does that need to shift by? Well, the way we can figure that out is think about any point. So right here, for example, we see that at a price level of 110, there's a demand of 5. Well, what we need for there to be is for there to be at a price level of 110, we need for there to be a demand of 15. Right? Because we need to get this blue curve to move back to the right until we get to the light blue. So we think about every point here. So we take another point here, it needs to move this far to the right, and so on. We need to keep moving these points to the right until they get us back to that light blue curve. Well, in order for that to happen, we need it to be that at a price level of 110, we go from having 5 in GDP to 15. And the way we do that is to increase G by 10 billion. Essentially what's going on is, how do we get from 5 to 15? Well, the government came out and said, you know what? We are going to spend an extra 10 billion. We are going to increase government spending by $10 billion. So one thing that's notable here is that, so we need to increase it by 10. One thing that's notable here is that, notice we had to increase government spending by 10 billion in order to get us back to where we started. And even though our GDP only went down 5 billion, and we're only trying to get equilibrium GDP to go back up by 5. So it went down from 15 down to 10. We just need to get it back to 15 billion. So increasing G by 10 will increase GDP by 5. And so the reason for that is, essentially, some of that increased spending sort of gets absorbed by a price increase. So we had the idea of, if all of us decide to spend an extra, so let's say a coffee at Starbucks costs $4. I give everyone in the class $4 to go buy Starbucks. We are not actually going to increase our total coffee consumption by 1 cup per person, because as a result of all these people wanting to buy coffee, we would expect Starbucks to raise their prices. And so some people, they got an extra $4, but now coffee costs $5, and they're actually going to opt to not purchase the coffee. For 27, if we think about expansionary monetary policy, we're wanting to know about equilibrium GDP and price level. That is an indicator that we should be drawing aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Remember, we do that. Price level is on the Y. GDP is on the X. Expansionary monetary policy means we're trying to shift aggregate demand to the right. It's going from this point to this. We do that. Price level increases and GDP increases. Okay, for 28, let's think about what's going on when the Fed sells bonds to banks. So we have the Fed here, banks here, bonds going from the Fed to the banks, selling them, so the banks are giving the Fed dollars. And so what that means then is, if we're thinking about the market for borrowing and lending, all of a sudden, if there's fewer dollars available, if there's a reduction in the supply of dollars, well, if you want to borrow, now you're going to have to pay more for it. So the interest rates are going to increase. That's the first thing we noted, is that we notice that interest rates increase. And then we're wanting to talk about investment here. Well, we know that the investment demand curve relates the interest rate to the quantity of investment. And we know that it slopes down, right? Because as interest rates go down, it's cheaper to borrow and invest. Okay, well, interest rates went up here. So that means we'll say that we maybe started off down here. Interest rates went up. So now we've gone over to here. So our investment has decreased. So interest rate increased, investment decreased. Our answer is A. A bank sees the value of one of its investments increase. How does it maintain its leverage ratio? Well, let's think about what the balance sheet is going to look like. Assets, liabilities, and equity. And if the value of an investment increases, so that means the assets are going to increase. And that happens, equity is going to increase, right? So it's not like we went out and borrowed more money. All that happened was something we owned. Maybe it was a stock or something went up in value. Well, now our bank is worth more. We have to make sure both sides of the balance sheet go up by the same amount, which happens. The next thing that happens is if the bank wants to maintain its leverage ratio, so let's say that its leverage ratio is equal to 4. And just to try to put some numbers into it, we'll say that the investments increase by 1, and which means that equity increases by 1. Well, if we want our leverage ratio to equal 4, remember, leverage ratio equal to 4 means assets equals 4 times equity. So if we increase our equity by 1, we need to have a total increase in assets of 4. Well, we got one of those increases in assets from the investment going up, but we want to increase our assets by 3 more. So essentially we're trying to grow the bank. In order to increase the left side of the balance sheet by 3, we have to increase the right side of the balance sheet by 3. So this means we have to borrow money. So we are increasing our loans. The bank is increasing its debt. So we have to borrow means we have to take on debt. The answer is A. So now we're thinking about money demand and money supply. Money demand slopes down. So this is the interest rate here. This is the quantity of money. And so money demand slopes down because when the interest rate goes down, I'm going to opt to hold more cash, right? I'd rather just hold on to the money rather than put it in the bank if I'm not really getting much interest anyway. Whereas once the interest rate is high, then I'm not going to want to hold money. I don't want to keep it in my wallet if I can earn a lot of interest by putting it in the bank. So Z, the downward sloping line, represents money demand. Money supply, remember the Fed controls the money supply. So money supply is whatever the Fed wants it to be. So whatever quantity the Fed chooses for its money supply, that's what it is. Essentially, when the interest rate changes, that doesn't change money supply. The only thing that changes money supply is the Fed deciding it wants to. So that's W. So the answer here is E. So for 31, let's go ahead and draw an aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. So we start off right here in long run equilibrium. And we have an increase in aggregate demand. So notice that what that does is that moved us from here up to here. So we had an increase in price and an increase in GDP. Well, as you would expect from the name like self-correcting, what self-correcting thinks is that on our own, we will eventually get back to long-run full employment GDP, this point right here. So in order for that to happen, we need to think about what is going to happen to aggregate supply. Notice these three all ask about aggregate supply. D talks about a permanent decrease in GDP, which is not going to happen here because remember, we think about self-correcting. The only thing that changes long-run GDP are things like changes in capital and technology. So in order for us to get from this point back to long-run equilibrium GDP, what we're going to need to do is adjust supply, and we actually need to adjust supply so that our supply intersects demand back at this long-run equilibrium GDP. So we think that what is going to happen is we need supply to decrease. That'll take us back to here. So sort of recap. We think that's this point 1. This is point 2. So we move from 1 to 2 in the setup of the problem. And then we have a decrease in supply, which gets us from 2 to 3. So we have a decrease in aggregate supply. So the answer here is C. We're going to think about the demand for euros here. So the market for euros. So price of euros, the exchange rate, quantity of euros. Start off with supply and demand of euros. Incomes in the United States increase. Well, when the incomes in the United States increase, one thing that consumers in the United States will do is purchase more goods made in Europe. If we are purchasing more goods made in Europe, in order to do that, we need euros. And so what happens is the United States people in the United States will demand more euros, right? If I want to buy more Ferraris, I need to acquire the euros I need to do that. So that would be an increase in demand. So demand shifts out or to the right. Suppose interest rates in the United States increase. So when interest rates increase, that often talks about the interest rates that are being paid on bonds. So if you want to buy US bonds, you need US dollars to buy bonds and get the high interest rate, which means that there is an increase in demand for US dollars. So we think about supply and demand of dollars. Even without thinking about the effect on supply, an increase in demand will lead to an increase in price. The other thing that will happen, and again, just being able to do that, noticing that the dollar is getting more expensive. So relative to other currencies, the dollar will get more expensive. The answer is A. That is sufficient to know to solve the problem. The other thing that is going to happen is there's actually going to be a decrease in supply. And that is going to happen because people who are holding dollars aren't going to want to supply them. I'm not going to want to trade my dollars to someone. I'd rather hold on to them myself so I can buy US bonds with them. And so you think, well, we started, our original supply and demand was right here. Our new supply and demand is up here. So there's definitely an increase in the price of US dollars. 34, we're going to think about tariffs here. So with tariffs, that is when we put a tax on imports. And what that does is it makes the goods imported higher. So it increases prices to consumers. So prices increase. If you remember, the reason that tariffs exist is because they are meant to encourage domestic production. So quantity produced in our country is higher. So price increases and quantity produced increases. So this graph here is going to show what's going on. This blue line here represents the world price. Notice the world price is below the equilibrium domestic price. And that is because that is a sign that we are going to be implementing a tariff, right? We're implementing a tariff because our country is a net importer. We are an importer of a good if it is cheaper to buy it from a producer abroad. So if their price is below our equilibrium price, okay? Well, a tariff is going to serve to increase the world price because it is something that if you are buying from a world producer, you're going to have to pay. So an international producer. So what that does is notice that moves our equilibrium from this price up to here. So prices are higher. And why is quantity produced higher? Well, we know that supply slopes up. And so when price increases here, that's going to move our suppliers from here up to here. Okay, last one. So we are thinking about the supply and demand of money. As we saw before, demand for money slopes down, and supply is a vertical line. Remember, supply is chosen, money supply is chosen by the Fed. It's whatever they want it to be. The price here is the interest rate, and the x-axis is the quantity of money. We're saying there's an increase in demand. And I don't think we talked specifically about transaction demand. Just think about this as an increase in demand for money. So demand shifts out or to the right. So what happens to our equilibrium? Moves up. So the interest rate increases. The actual quantity is unaffected. So increase, and then it'll be unaffected. All right, that's all we got.